stay on schedule. Get out by April. All right, Heavenly Father, thank you for this time together, studying the Word together. Thank you for the study that we had in the fall, and ask you to bless our time this spring. Unpack a little bit more and go a little bit further. That we just pray. All right, so it has been a while, so I did decide to do a little bit of a review, just so we kind of remember where we were, and everybody remember where we're parked, so then we can pick up and go from there. So just a couple of summary statements. Remember that early on we started with considering that book of Genesis, well, actually really the Bible, and a lot of the things that we discussed would apply to each individual book, and in some cases even passages within that passages within each book. And so it's important to remember that the scripture, regardless of where we pull it from, is going to have a context that goes with it. We talked about various aspects of what that means. And this is true for what we do on Sunday mornings as well as now or anytime we study. So the author is important, the audience is important, the culture is important, the cognitive environment, we call it, the way they thought and communicated back then was important. So all of these are things that when we approach scripture to study it, we need to take those into account. Otherwise, we risk, remember, imposing ourselves on the book rather than having it expositionally talk to us. And this was a quote that I found back a ways, but it was a theologian that said, while the Bible was written for us, we have to remember that it was not written to us. And so we've got to step back, figure out who it was written to, and that helps us to understand what it was trying to communicate, because obviously the messages that are in here are very specific. God put them in here for a purpose, and they're going to communicate to the original audience the same kinds of things that they should communicate to us. We talked a little bit about things like literary patterns, chiastic structures, parallelisms. Toledo's within the book of Genesis specifically was one we looked at, but remember that literary patterns and the way in which the authors back then would have written can oftentimes teach us about what's important, the kinds of messages they're trying to convey, and what it is that we need to be able to pull out of these particular passages. And Jim has reminded us of this a couple of times over the last few weeks, but I would say it again here. We need to remember that while scripture, this book in its original form is inerrant, the interpretations that we come up with are human and therefore are not. So just as a disclaimer, like I said last time, this time, I mean, these are things that I think at the moment, and a year from now, I may think differently. And so we're just here to kind of explore and see what God might be trying to communicate with us at this point. Then we moved on into the book. So we started with Genesis 1 and the creation story. So a couple of reminders there. Remember, we saw how God separated or made several separations to create the aspects of creation that we read about that are recorded for us here in Genesis 1, because remember, he would separate light from darkness, separate water from land, and the animals came out of the land. So there was just these separations that God spoke into being, and within that context, he was able to create physical structure. Of course, the problem, as we saw in verse 2 of chapter 1, was that the earth was without form and void. We discussed those Hebrew terms a little bit and realized that that particular phrase is actually the basis for the rest of the chapter as far as creation goes. So that what we see God do over the next several verses is on days 1 through 3, he actually creates these functional spaces, gives it the form, and then day 4 through 6 installs functionaries. And those functionaries, of course, then carry out the purpose of those individual units. We also saw, this will come in a little bit more in our discussion later. We might not get to it tonight, but certainly next week. Remember that there are aspects of God's provision that come out of these different day combinations. Days 1 and 4 go together, 2 and 5 go together, and 3 and 6. And remember, he would give us things like time and food and seasons and harvest and things like that. That it's really more about the functional aspects of creation than any kind of physical structure. And then, of course, we saw that on day 7, what did God do? The functional integrity of the creation was good. In fact, it was very good, and he rested. Okay. I would take a minute here to remind us, kind of tie these first two ideas together, that remember the first audience that received the entirety of these books. Chances are Moses was working from some earlier either oral tradition on these first few chapters, or there might even been some written copies of these kinds of things that Moses then incorporated in what he was writing. But what Moses was doing with the Pentateuch was creating a document that the Israelites at the foot of Mount Sinai was going to begin to operate from. And that's important because that's the context of that seventh-day rest, as God's trying to teach them how to observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. The way in which Moses wrote up the creation story in Genesis 1 also kind of goes with that. So really some important lessons that they were trying to learn that, of course, we would do well to keep in mind as well. All right, I pulled in one of the old slides from last year where you can kind of see that relationship. So let there be light on day 1, and then remember he creates the greater light and lesser light, sun and the moon on day 4. Creates the expanse, waters above from the waters below, and occupies those with fish and birds, and then creates land. Land separates it away from the water, and animals and man were created on day 6. All right. Remember that creation actually involved 2 sort of, I won't call them stories, but 2 aspects of creation are given in chapter 1 and chapter 2. Chapter 2, we move into sort of another view of what's going on and specifically focus on this creation of human beings. We saw in the context of chapter 1 that God said, let's make man in our own image, right? And we see that sort of put back in place or confirmed in chapter 2. We saw that the creation of man is sort of a dual mechanism, meaning that first he created the dust, or created his form from the dust of the ground, this is verse 7, chapter 2, and then breathed into him the breath of life. And so there's kind of a spiritual aspect and a physical aspect. And we talked about the different views of what it means to be created in God's image. And it's my conclusion, I think, that reality probably includes all 3. These are not exclusive of each other. So the reflectional just refers to the fact that we reflect God to those around us, and has a lot more to do with our spiritual nature than our physical nature, because obviously God doesn't have a physical nature. The relational view, we talked about why would have God even created us? It wasn't because he needed us. It was because he wanted to. And a lot of the wanted to revolves around this aspect of relational interactions. And certainly as humans, being relational is an important part of who we are and what we go about doing on our daily life. But one of the more important aspects of the image of God that we dug into a little bit further was what we call the representational view, which is a little bit different than the other 2. And in this case, we are talking about that, especially in this second creation description, where God takes Adam and Eve, puts them in the garden, and we saw that he gave them jobs to do where they were going to tend it and keep it. And we saw how this language that Moses uses when he talks about the garden is very sacred, and it relates very closely to the language we see when it describes the tabernacle. So you remember when we were kind of studying through, we just kind of ran through the tabernacle. We'll go through this again when we get to the actual tabernacle in years ahead. But we saw different aspects of that tabernacle very much relate to what was happening in chapter 1 and chapter 2. And so again, what Moses is doing is very intentional. The way he writes 1 and 2 in Genesis relates directly to what's going on at the end of Exodus, and as we set up the Levitical system. Okay, so probably the most important bits here is that you remember in ancient days, whenever temples were built, some kind of an icon was usually installed, some kind of an idol that represented the deity. And in this case, there's an actual individual person created in the image of the deity that is going to represent that deity, not just in gold or wood, but in flesh, and will actually help in the carrying out of the priestly duties. Okay. And the instructions that God gave, where we see in chapter 1, he said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And then the other part of those instructions was subdue the earth and have dominion over the fish and the birds and the animals and so on. And so that's one aspect of our priestly duty in the context of creation. And then the second piece and the second description was what I mentioned earlier. Takes them, puts them in the garden, and their job was to tend and keep it the way the priests would have tended and kept the tabernacle, the Levites and Aaron's family. And so these were the purpose, these were the functions that God's image was supposed to carry with it. And that was Adam and Eve's job to begin with. Okay. Then, of course, what happens? We get to chapter 3 and enter the serpent. Okay. And so we talked about quite a bit about the temptation that Adam and Eve were confronted with. And Satan was very intentional in the way he started to communicate to them and was tempting them. So largely the conversation can be summed up with these 3 accusations that Satan made, and each one kind of ramps it up a little bit further. So he doesn't outright lie initially, but eventually we do get that far. But he essentially convinces Eve and Adam that God doesn't want what's best for you. Okay, did he really say that? God is not good, and he's actually holding you back. God knows that you can know as much as he does, but he refuses to let you know that knowledge. And you can't trust his word. He's told you that you're going to die, and you know that's not going to happen. So he's just not playing straight with you. So these are ways that Satan very intentionally short circuits the relationship that Adam and Eve had with God, this very direct revelation of interacting with him individually. And Adam and Eve bought in, and they decided that, yeah, maybe that Satan was right, and God's not been playing fair with us. They wanted to be independent from the creator. They didn't want to take on that role of the priest in that context and help God with the subduing and dominion of creation. They wanted to make some of the decisions. They wanted God's role. They wanted the knowledge that God had. And so they took it illegitimately. And rather than serving as his helpers, they tried to take over that role instead. And of course, we know what happened after that. The next phase we moved into was what happens after. And of course, I have this as a kind of life outside the garden, but even while they were still inside the garden, we see several things happen. The cost of the failure of man was swift and devastating, really, to the system that God had created. And we looked at several things that were damaged with the decision they made, the sin they committed. Remember, it's important to realize Satan did not force them to do what they did. They chose to do what they did. Okay. And so while temptation leads us, sin is our action. And so even when Eve starts to try to blame the serpent, God said, well, I'll deal with the serpent later, but this is on you. You're really the one that made that decision. And so sin damaged our relationship with God. And we see immediately that when their eyes were opened, they hide from God when he comes to the garden next. And he wants to know why they're hiding from him. Well, they're hiding from him because they are ashamed and guilty of the sin that they committed that damaged their relationship with each other. Okay. God says, Adam, where are you? What does he say? Well, I'm hiding. Well, why are you hiding? Because I don't have any clothes on. Well, why don't you, who told you you don't have any clothes on? And he says, the woman you gave me is the one that made me eat that fruit. And we know that's not the truth. He made a choice to eat that fruit himself. Okay. So not only were they hiding from each other, remember they had to make themselves some clothing. They start blaming each other. And then when we see that God begins to voice these curses, we see in the phrase that he gives to Eve in verse 16, that your desire is going to be for your husband and he will rule over you. And we saw how that desire shall be for your husband was actually control. You are going to want to control your husband and he is going to want to rule over you. And those two will always be in opposition. So here we've got Adam and Eve, who were created in God's image. We're told to do this job in chapter 1, placed in the garden and told to tend and keep it in chapter 2. And now we've got an image of God that is non-functional. Okay. The two are not going to work together to do what they were set up to do and created to do. And not only that, they begin to work against each other in trying to carry out God's tasks. Third, we see that sin resulted in spiritual death immediately and physical death eventually. And so, in a sense, the serpent did not outright lie, but what we saw is that oftentimes what the serpent tells us is not exactly what the truth is. And so sometimes he tells us things that get us trapped and get us to make decisions that we shouldn't be making. But in the end, what God says is always correct. And so sure enough, the spiritual death was immediate and would have to be fixed. And then physical death was eventual. Remember, the physical death played around that access to the tree of life. So a couple of verses later, they're out of the garden, no longer have access to that tree of life, and will not have access to that tree of life again until the end of Revelation, where we are allowed access back. The other piece here is that within those, I guess we'd say the curses, but these statements that God is making to the serpent and even the man, Adam, we see that God is already sort of almost like a premonition or a prophecy of how we're going to actually deal with this problem. And as he talks to the snake, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring, and he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. Okay. And so, of course, now we know who is that offspring. Jesus. Okay. Now, Eve wasn't sure. She wasn't looking that far ahead, because remember that once they got kicked out and were trying to make their way on their own, they began to have their own family, build their own family. And of course, Cain was born, and she named him, God has given me offspring, a man, and has helped me have. And so in her mind, Cain was going to be the answer to solve all the problems. But of course, in reality, it was going to take a lot longer than that. God's plan was going to unfold over several generations, thousands of years. The last piece that sort of goes with the function, that representational view of the image, is that we no longer have that ability to carry out their purpose. And so at the end of our conversation about the failure, when we think about the way that the tabernacle was set up, you'll notice there's one piece that doesn't have a correlation in Genesis 1 and 2. And that is that altar, the burnt altar, where we are going to make sacrifice for sin. And that is, of course, the only entryway into this complex where God tabernacles with us from now on, until such a time as Jesus is going to give us access to the holiest of holies, as he, through his blood, is able to pierce that veil. So a lot of the creation story, a lot of the fall of humans is actually told in the design of the tabernacle. And that's why God was very specific about how it was to be built and what those structures were supposed to represent. And of course, the best part of this story, the consolation and the hope of Israel, is that one day that offspring will be born. And as we sort of study this semester, we will start to pull in Abraham's story, and that's going to be kind of the start of God's revelation of this promised one who is going to deal with these issues that were created. This breaking of the relationship between us and God. All right, and then we finally got to talk about Cain and Abel a little bit. It was interesting that both of them, where we basically meet them as adults, both of them are about to sacrifice or bringing a sacrifice to God. And of course, in these days, sacrificially or sacrifices were not tied to the sin debt like they are in the Levitical system. But this was a concept that the ancient cultures would have carried out, and sometimes with very bad intentions and motivations. But in this case, what it appears Cain and Abel are doing is bringing these offerings to the Lord. And the reason they're doing it is essentially to benefit from his presence. So we see that even though they're not in the garden, God still interacts with them here. And of course, the important thing in this story there in the end of chapter 4 is God had regard for Abel's offering, but he did not regard Cain's. So Cain gets very angry. Okay. And so we see, or as we discussed, we see that why did God not regard Cain's offering? It was not because it was plants instead of animals. It had very little to do with the actual sacrifice itself. It had more to do with Cain and the fact that his heart was not in the right place. And there was, when we talk about Abel, his offering was, remember, the sort of the best he had. It was described as the firstborn of his flock and the fat portions. I mean, that was kind of the choice pieces of lamb that he was offering to the Lord. And more importantly, the way in which Abel viewed God was one of trust, one of worship, one of devotion. Whereas we see from Cain, kind of this, he gets angry. And even when he's talking to God, we see that he's very entitled. He feels like my offering deserves to be recognized and for you to give me blessings. And we'll see that this becomes a theme for the Israelites later, is that, look, I'm not interested in you just doing this for just going through this process. And it kind of really applies to a conversation we had recently about communion. We don't want to just go through that as if it means nothing. This is something that means a great deal. And these sacrifices meant a great deal. And what was more important to God than anything was obedience, that we do the things that he says in his word, and the idea of behavior matters is going to become a very important theme, start to finish. Okay, Genesis to Revelation. So we see God warn Cain, says sin is crouching at the door, and it will take you if you let it. Its desire is for you, and more specifically, its desire is for your destruction. But notice that Cain had the ability to rule over it if he had chosen correctly. He did not. Sometime later, we don't know the timing, but he and Abel are out in the field, and his response is what? Kills Abel, and Abel dies. Blood seeps into the ground, similar to what we see coming out in or unfolding in chapter 3. God comes looking, and well, where's your brother? I'm not his keeper. I don't know where he is. And so kind of the same, well, it's actually a worse response to God than Adam had. Adam was, I've hidden myself. Cain was just saying that, I don't know. And then God says, well, you do know, because his blood's crying out to me right now. And so we see that Cain does not heed God's warnings, and this results in a curse of Cain from God, which actually takes the curse that we see Adam and Eve bear actually quite a bit further. So in the context of Adam, in chapter 3, we say, you ate the tree, which I commanded you not to. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you will eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it will bring forth. You shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken. You were dust, and to dust you will return. Okay, now work and tending the ground was always supposed to be part of Adam's life, right? Just like in Eve's case, multiplying, multiply and fill the earth. She was going to play a central role, hence the mother of all, her name. And we see now that because of their failure, that this work, right, their inability to carry out the things that God asked them to carry out, you can still do those things, but now it's going to be painful, and it's going to be a lot of work, and you're going to sweat doing it, and the ground is not going to react the way you'd like. Okay. In his case, and of course, childbirth is going to be much more painful than it maybe otherwise would have been originally. Bottom line, when we get to Cain, then we see again God go a little bit further. He says that because your brother's blood is crying out for me, so you have contaminated the ground, which you were supposed to tend and keep, right? You have not only have you not done what I asked you to do, but you have gone further and murdered your brother. And he says that when you work the ground, it won't yield to you its strength at all. Okay. You are cursed from the ground. It has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood, and you shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. And we see Cain, rather than respond with regret, well, with repentance, we see him respond with regret, not so much for doing what he did, but for getting caught in it, basically. Cain says, my punishment's greater than I can bear. He's just complaining. Behold, you have driven me today from the ground. From your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me. Now, God never said that. Okay, so he's adding there. And God says, not so. And even if they do, then vengeance will be taken on them sevenfold. Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. And Cain went away from the presence of the Lord. That's a key. And settled in the land of Nod. All right. And then the last part of our story there was we kind of skipped over to the end of chapter 4. And we see that Adam and Eve had a third son named Seth, who was born to replace Abel. And as we see Eve name him Seth, for God has appointed me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed it. All right, so that's kind of where we left off. And a couple of things to kind of tie us into Noah, because Noah will start us off towards the end of chapter 5. But at the end of 4, we see Cain's family and a lot of things that Cain's family is known for that were kind of developments within the context of cities and instruments and livestock, animal husbandry, those kinds of things. And then in 5, we actually start a new section. This is we know that from the phrase at the beginning, this is the book of the generations of Adam. And see kind of a summary of the creation, created man, made him in his likeness, male and female, blessed them, named the man when they were created. And then we get sort of a list of generations from Seth. And so a couple of important things come out here. And we will kind of see this as it unfolds and leads us into Noah's story, starting in chapter 6. Well, actually, Noah's story is going to start really at the beginning of, it'll be chapter 6, verse 9. But we'll see some setup going on there at the beginning. All right. So any questions about any of that? That's kind of a brief half-hour summary of where we were last year. Okay. And I have cut out a few important steps too that we might have to bring back in later. But that gets us, I think, refocused on the issue at hand. And that issue is what? Messed up. And then Cain and Abel. Cain also messed up. And we'll come back to these lists here in a second. But eventually we find ourselves in Noah's time, and things are even more of a mess. Okay. Now, as we approach this, we've got to remember where we started last year. We've got to approach this passage exactly the same way we've approached all the others. Okay. So if we come to this passage in Noah with wrong motives or start asking the wrong questions, what's the problem? We get the wrong answers, or more specifically, we're going to miss the message. Okay. So we can get caught up in questions like, was the flood a local event? Was it global? Well, that's not even a relevant question because Moses and the Israelites had no idea what a globe was, right? So global means nothing to them. Did the waters cover the entire planet? Did they even go over Mount Everest? I mean, these are questions that Moses didn't care about. Did Methuselah die before the flood, or did he die at wickedness in the flood? Because we know that by age, his year would be that last year when the flood happened. Based on the description we get, obviously, engineers and physicists might get involved and say, look, that's not even seaworthy. Well, that's not even an issue because that's not what we're trying to tell here. What about these animals? Were koalas and sloths on this boat? Because sloths are in South America. It would have taken them a really long time, as slow as they move to get there. Koalas the same way. And so these are really not concerns that we have to be concerned about. What about the carnivores? We often wondered what the lions and the tigers eat because they were on this boat for over a year. We think 40 days and 40 nights, but as we expanded out, it was over 370 days they were on that boat. So now we're trying to figure out, okay, well, maybe the cows were having calves and those were being fed to whatever. I mean, it just gets messy. On a little more technical level, you're going to have scholars and theologians that'll get into arguments over the internal inconsistencies. Like it just doesn't hold together. This story has got to be completely fabulous and doesn't have necessarily anything reliable in it. Obviously very dangerous. We don't want to get into those discussions at all either. If we find things that are unreliable, what does that tell us? that wasn't what it was supposed to communicate anyway. We're off on the wrong track. So we've got to come back to focusing on what's real. And then last one I had down here is one we talked about a little bit last year. This particular story is one of the main, I guess, passages that folks use to try to argue that Moses didn't write the first 5 books. Now, maybe he wrote a little bit of it, but there were multiple authors over time, and we give them these remarkable names that E and P and J and so on. And a lot of the arguments that those folks make based on this passage and the way in which it's structured. And so, again, if you're focusing on that, and their argument is that you don't get a coherent story. But when you focus on the right things, the story is very coherent. And more importantly, it's very coherent within the stuff that's gone before. And it ties very nicely into the one we'll hopefully work into next week. Well, we're running out of time, probably the week after, where we start talking about the Tower of Babel. And so there's these folks that approach these first 11 chapters like these little cookie cutter bits and pieces of proto-history. And each one kind of represents some little bit that Moses might have found or some other guy added. But these 11 chapters tell a story, a very important story that sets up where we tend to go this semester, and that is Abraham. Okay. And we get into those patriarchs, and the patriarchs then, of course, are the important pieces. The reason why we want to be careful, of course, and Jim alluded to this not too long ago, although he didn't necessarily take us to the verses, but if you look in 1 Timothy, remember he was talking about church structure and elders and so on as he was talking to Timothy in this letter. But notice one of the things that he pulls out, almost the first thing he says in Timothy's letter, verse 3, I urge you when I was going to Macedonia, remain at Ephesus so that you may change certain persons not to teach different doctrines. Because even in Timothy's day and Paul's day, there were people who devoted themselves to myths and endless genealogies. These are promoting speculations rather than stewardship from God by faith. And the aim of our charge is love, issues from a pure heart, and a good conscience and a sincere faith. Certain persons, by swerving from these, have wandered away into vain discussions, desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding what they're saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. I mean, he's talking specifically about the folks I just described that are digging into these genealogies and these stories and picking it apart, looking for these things that are meaningless and are not taking the story that God is trying to communicate out of these structures. And so it's important for us to step back and not be caught up in those things. I mean, where we're kind of in danger nowadays, what do you think devoting themselves to myths are? I mean, you've all been stuck in one of those conversations where somebody's sharing a conspiracy theory with you. And this is nothing new, okay? Or they're trying to show you things that they think are Christian based, but are not. This is nothing new. Paul and the apostles were dealing with Gnostics, secret knowledge, things on the internet that, well, they didn't have the internet, but things that the rest of us don't see, but we do, and you should listen to us. I mean, this is the heart of humanity. Okay. And this is what this story is about, is we see when we take the overall progression of Genesis 1 through 11, and I'll finish this out as we kind of keep adding to this story. But as our kind of final summary statement here, as we look at Genesis 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then work our way into 5 and 6, what we see is an alternating story of I'm in the presence of God and I get cast out, and I get back into the presence of God. I want to get back in the presence of God, but I get cast out. And then as we see it just go back and forth. Okay. And so we see Cain. Well, this is my summary statement here. Let's keep going. Within the flood narrative, we've got this. Here we go. All right, so where do we start? We had creation, and then Adam and Eve start out with God in the garden. You can't get much closer to the presence of God than that, right? And this is what your relational image of God is all about. This is what your representational image of God is all about. We are there in his capacity to do the things within that garden for him. And what do? They disobeyed, and their reaction was one of shame and hiding and guilt. Okay, of course, they had other reactions as well, where they blamed each other, blamed the snake, and it really wasn't my fault or whatever. What was God's response? Drove him out of the garden. Okay, you're no longer in my presence in that way. And so we see the most importantly, they are driven away. Why did he drive them away from the garden? The tree of life. We do not want you to have access to that tree of life in the state that you're in right now. And that tree of life represents God's life-giving presence in a very real sense, which is why that's the reward at the end. So I don't know how long it's going to take Jim to get to those chapters 20 through 22 in Revelation, but when we get there, future, yes, sometime future. And at some point, we will see that tree play a very important role in what we have to look forward to. Then we see Cain and Abel doing their sacrifices, seeking God's blessing, right? Things go wrong. What does Cain do? He murders Abel. And we said his reaction was one of indifference. Like, I'm not my brother's keeper. Why do I care? You should be keeping up with him. And as we just saw, what happens? Cain is driven away from the land, driven away from God's presence, driven away from his family. And this is where some people just kind of write off the genealogies that come along and try to dig into all this minutia. What does it mean and all this kind of stuff? Well, what it means is that, or what Moses is putting it in here for, is that we get Cain's family history here, or his descendants. We see several generations. We see things that God blesses them with in the context of the inventions that they make and different ways in which they make their lives easier. But towards the end of this story, we see a guy named Lamech who says to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's will be 77-fold. And so there are multiple ways that folks have tried to interpret this over the years. We won't really dig into those, but the bottom line here is that Lamech is boasting about the fact that he's killed somebody for probably bumping into him. And basically he's saying that if God was going to protect Cain sevenfold, right? Because basically God says what? If anybody kills you, then I will take vengeance on them sevenfold. So if by Cain's sin, God is going to avenge me, or him sevenfold, he's going to avenge me 77-fold because of the sin I committed. So not only do we have presumption, we have him boasting in God's protection, but we also have this complete disregard for other humans. Okay. Now, again, there's lots of speculation about what's going on here. Some say that he's actually killed Cain in this process, but I don't think we want to track any of that. We then see the introduction of Seth. And so there at the end of verse 4, to Seth was born a son. He called his name Enosh. And at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Okay. So what we've got is a direct counterpoint between Cain and his line, who end with Lamech, and Seth and his line, who begin to call on the name of the Lord. And we see these generations as we go through. And one of the more important ones we can pull out down there at the bottom in verse 21 is Enoch had lived 65 years. He fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God, and after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters, all the days of Enoch were 365. He walked with God, and he was not. So all the others have a death date listed when they died. Enoch does not have that. And so the understanding would be that God took him. And the reason why he took him is why? He walked with him. Okay, so these are very specific structures that Moses is putting in where we see Cain's and Seth's line going in very opposite directions within this context of the presence of God. One that seeks it, one that does not, and is moving further and further away from it. And most importantly, we see then in chapter 6, well, at the end of Seth's line, we see that Lamech, a different Lamech, in Seth's line, lived, fathered a son called Noah. And he calls him Noah because out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall give us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. You didn't know when you name a kid Noah that that's what it means. But obviously Lamech was looking around him. He sees a lot of painful toil. He sees a lot of results of the failure and the curses that God put on his family. And his hope was that in Noah, some of this would be relieved. He didn't really know what that meant, though. As it turns out, God did provide some of that. We see he dies, and then, of course, Noah fathers 3 sons. And then we move into Noah's story a little bit, where this is an introduction to Noah's story in chapter 6. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, the daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw the daughters of man were attractive. They took as their wives any they chose. And the Spirit of the Lord said, my spirit will not abide with them forever. And his flesh, for he is flesh, his days will be 120. We see the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. They were also there after the flood. So there's one of those internal inconsistencies that we don't know what to do with. I mean, this is some people that were front of the flood, also found after the flood. These sons of God came into daughters of man. They bore children to them. These were mighty men of old and men of renown. And now we get to the kind of the climax of this story. So the lines have mixed, or they go in opposite directions. The lines are now mixing. And we see at verse 5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. So the Lord decided, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Okay. So we've got this mixing between the sons of God and the daughters of man, which would illustrate sort of this combination. Now, of course, there's a lot of discussion about what sons of God means, and a lot of ways in which people have addressed that. And scripturally, we can kind of back up a lot of those. I'd say from my perspective, the most important piece for me has been, if you look at Luke and the genealogy that he prepared, end of chapter 3, says Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as was supposed, of Joseph, son of Heli, and so on, goes back forth. And we drop down there to the bottom. And we see the son of Enos, the son of Seth, the son of Adam. What's the last phrase? The son of God. So Adam and Seth in that line were considered sons of God. And so what we've got here is a mixing of these philosophies, really, and one that has not been for the better. And we see that both in Seth's line and Cain's line, and probably all the other lines that existed this time, wickedness. Okay. Wickedness to the point that God has decided what? He's going to destroy him. He's going to regret. Okay. Now, what does that mean? He's had enough. Okay. Now, does God regretting and deciding that he's going to destroy them, does this mean that I screwed up and I got to fix it? That is not what it means. Okay. God did not make his mistake. What we see here and when he regrets, and anytime we see God regret in the Bible, and we see it multiple times, or we see God say things and then he changes his mind later. This is not because God's wishy-washy. All right. What we see is God responding in truth to his nature. Okay. And we see here that God is regretting that he is going to have to do something about it, something very drastic. Okay. He would prefer not to. He would have preferred for Seth's line to stay clean. In fact, he would have preferred for Adam and Eve to not eat of that tree until he maybe told them it was okay. And so we see that he has to do something, not because he made a mistake, but because of who he is. Okay. Why does he have to do something? It's because of his holiness, his righteousness, and his justice. It demands that he respond to sin in this way. And that nature is unchangeable for him. There is no way around that. So we'll talk about God's holiness later, because of course, again, what is this all about? Who's getting this story originally? Those Israelites, Mount Sinai, Moses is up on the mountain, and they're down there playing around, messing up, doing wicked things continually. What did God say? I'm going to wipe them out. And so it just all kind of keeps coming back to that. And so we see that a lot of times God's activity and his decisions, if you want to call them that, are conditional. And he will promise things and then he will back off on those, not because his promise is not real and he didn't mean what he said. It's because people listened. Okay. Remember when Jonah was preaching to Nineveh, he goes out and hangs out on the mountain. Why was he pouting? I knew you were going to give when they repented, you were going to relent and not destroy them, and I wanted them destroyed. And so God didn't change his mind and decide not to destroy Nineveh, except for the fact that what? Nineveh changed their minds. They listened to what Jonah said, and it only lasted a generation. They were destroyed shortly thereafter. But for that moment in time, God's prophet had brought a word to them. They accepted it. It changed their hearts and their direction. And so oftentimes when we look throughout scripture, whenever God seems to change his mind, it usually is predicated by somebody or somebodies have done what he asked. And so based on behavior, we see God oftentimes do things. And again, this is an important lesson for these people, right? He's trying to get them to understand, even while they're down there messing around with that golden calf, that your behavior matters, right? You are going to be holy like I am holy, and this is the way in which this is going to work. And if you will do these things, I will bless you. If you don't do these things, I'm going to curse you. Okay. And so we finish off this kind of introductory stuff here. We see him decide to blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, going to include the animals and the plants and the birds and everything with them. I am sorry that I have made all of this, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And so this is kind of the second very important messianic pointer towards Jesus. Okay. Because what is he going to do over the next 3 chapters? Noah and his family and animals are going to be saved through the flood in this ark. And it's all because Noah found favor. Why did Noah find favor? Because he was a righteous man. Okay. As we pick up his story, and this is where we'll pick up next week in verse 9. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. He walked with God. Just as probably Lamech did before him, Methuselah did before him, but that line on its own was it. And so the idea that nowadays one man's righteousness is the basis for our salvation is clearly defined here in Noah's story. And we also see how one individual making the choices that they make does matter to God and can often affect the people around them. God will relent. Now, did everybody in Nineveh turn their lives around? Probably not. But enough did to where God spared that city for a generation. So even the unrighteous, this is where we get a really important clue as to that sort of common grace, where sometimes even the unrighteous experience God's grace and mercy because God is acting on behalf of the righteous. And we will see that theme show up multiple times through the stories of the patriarchs. Okay, because oftentimes, based on the behavior of the patriarchs and the way they handle themselves, the communities around them, pagan communities oftentimes benefited from what was going on. And they knew it, and some of them got it, some of them didn't. But the bottom line is that they figured out that God was with this family. God had chosen this family. There was a promise that was associated with it. Okay. All right. So we will pick up in chapter 6, verse 9, and make our way through Noah's story next week. Although before we get there, we're actually going to probably track a couple of things related to what I just said in the New Testament first. All right, any thoughts? All right, let's make sure we got all our slides here. Yeah. Yeah, so God's basically going backwards in time to the stuff we talked about in chapters 1 and 2, and basically is going to start over. Now, beforehand, he was going to start from scratch, but because of Noah, he's going to start from Noah because of Noah's righteousness. All right, well, let's pray and we'll head out. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this time again to study. Didn't really get to Noah's story tonight, but that's okay. Thank you for the way in which you set up the story for him. Thank you for showing us how important being in your presence is and how it's worth everything, and that we should try hard to find that, and just pray that you would help us tonight and this week as we think about this story and then study it next week, that we would take to heart this idea that just our decision and attempt to remain righteous can affect those around us, and hopefully actually convince them to give you a chance as well and want to be in your presence. Pray that we would not take that part of our job lightly, and that you would give us the opportunities to do just that. In your name I pray, amen.